12 Against the Gods by William Bolitho. Chapter 6. Cagliostro and Seraphina. The case of a double adventure, Lola with Casanova or Alexander with some honey-coloured chieftainess, instead of that little Persian gazelle Roxana, is an inevitable conjecture, now we have come so far. Would not the natural duad, man and wife, survive in the life of risk longer and healthier than any mere monad of adventure, if male, doomed to fail of a surfeit of his luck, if woman, to peter out from inanition of hers? In any case, one would look for important and amusing modifications of the laws, or rather dynamical habits, that seem to govern adventure. These are likely to be harmonic rather than logical, for life abominates logic. And this complication is heightened by the rareness of the case, almost necessarily confined to a particular class of adventure. For indeed, what could Alexander have done with a partner, or Columbus, or Casanova for that matter, or Lola? Their isolation was not a flaw, but the very order of the architecture of what they did, and suffered, the destruction of which would have turned all into that most insipid of fairy tales, the novelette. For our duad chord, we must look among adventurers whose activity was a business. That is, we must steer between the opposing dullnesses of swindling and trade. I can hardly think of anyone but Cagliostro and his Seraphina, the last colours in the sunset of old Europe. The man's real name was Giuseppe Balsamo. We are used to the habit of change of name, almost as regular in adventurers as in the three other professions that regularly use it, the monastery, the stage, and the streets. We know its almost ceremonial reason, the symbolical abjuration of ties, tasks, duties, those of family preparatory to those of society. Its most general motive, ambition, in its plainest symptoms, even to the poetry of snobbery. His father was a small storekeeper in Palermo, the date 1743. This Giuseppe, for short Beppo, grew into a stout, blunt-faced gutter hero, thievish, daring, calm, the bugbear of all the housewives and milksops of the neighbourhood. He cut washing lines, incited dogfights, bullied the timid urchins, and led the bold ones to expeditions against street vendors' carts, and added as much confusion as he could to the labyrinthine noise of the hot old city, where at any moment of the day or night there is a quarrel or a bargain being made. At the age of 12 he was sent to the seminary of St. Roch to learn his letters, was beaten industriously by the teachers and the porter, and ran away. His father was dead. His mother's brother got him admitted to the monastery of the Benfratelli, the entrance to the only career for a cleverish boy of his class. Here, after a time, he was sent to work for the apothecary of the establishment, to clean phials, weigh herbs, tend the alembics and sweep the floor, as well as learn the elements of the most sensual and exciting of sciences, chemistry. Even in its modern austerity, a chemical laboratory is the most fascinating place in the world to those lucky enough to possess strong curiosity and sense of smell. In the 18th century Sicilian monastery, where every bottle looked like a toy and contained a secret, where the materia medica was the Arabian Nights, and every piece of apparatus uncanny folklore, Beppo's faculties caught alight. He conceived the idea of magic. He learned so easily and well that his master took a fancy to him, and the queue of beggarly outpatients often had to wait for their potions, while the two were lost together in speculatory discussion and operations in the dark, aromatic crypt. As a spiritual antidote to this exaggeration, the brothers gave Beppo the task of reading to them at mealtime. The book preferred was some interminable martyrology, another potent irritant to his imagination, already alert with desire to commerce with the supernatural. But one day in Lent, these stories of devil-worsting bishops, lion-taming virgins, fireproof fakirs, and invulnerable confessors palled on him. Or his nature, which pushed him to practical jokes, suddenly saw the humour of the unkempt solemnity with which the brethren ate their soup, and he began to substitute, as he read the names of the most notorious whores of Palermo, for the holy ones in his book. For this, he was beaten with thongs and then chased from the community. He must have known more than he should to play this jackanapes trick. No doubt there must be a lost story of unmonastic escapades and encounters before the definite expulsion. It was not then as a lamb that he plunged into the loose life which his only official biographer, the Grand Inquisitor of Rome, now sets down. His next calling was that of a painter, which to him, to his city, and to his country, included a shabby, dabbling admixture of marble counterfeiter, distemperer, sign-writer, with the making of those canvas storms at sea, in the distance Vesuvius in eruption, whose manufacture, along with that of plaster casts of sentimental statuary, is the largest artistic product of Italy to this day. But art was overcrowded, even then. Beppo was forced, or chose, to eke out commissions with another local industry, inseparable as chaperonage from all societies where there is strict seclusion of women, that is, pandering. One of his clients was his pretty cousin's Romeo, whose letters he passed, and whose presents he intercepted. With admirable vitality, he added again to this sort of thing some amount of bespoke forgery. That is, he put his services and his pen at the command of persons in difficulties about a signature. It has been dug up that on one occasion he forged a whole will for the benefit of a religious community, and a pass-out for a monk in the name of his superior in Rome. With these mean and clever resources, he earned enough to eat well. All his life he had an enormous appetite for food, as common an accompaniment of great nervous force as its opposite. The superfluity he worked off in a violent bullying life. He became very muscular, and picked quarrels with sailors, beat the night watchman, established his reputation as a ward terror. All these essays are comically out of proportion, and superficially out of relation to the particular splendour of the destiny before him. Half a hooligan, half a crook. The two commonest and least interesting of human qualities, this is all his peevish biographers, Carlyle and the Inquisitor, make of him who was to become Cagliostro. Deduce that there must have been something that escaped their survey from his last scene in Palermo. This obnoxious lout appears abruptly to have captured the confidence of a goldsmith called Morano, and engaged him on a treasure hunt in a coast cave at midnight. In his nagging, prosecuting style, Carlyle presents this as an absurd swindle, an affair, like most events in history to him, of knave and dupe, with an easy laugh in it for Scotch canniness. But we, the jury, must notice that there are facts that do not fit into this view any more than the Inquisition's Beppo fits into the Cagliostro, who has less one-sided chronicles to attest him. There is magic in this affair, not only talk of dowsing, forked hazel rods and the rest, but circles in the moonlight and burning earth, and the invocation of devils, quite out of character with the loutish Beppo we are told to see. Only in the bare fact that, following a quarrel with the goldsmith, Beppo fled from Palermo, are we satisfied to acquiesce. His own story of the years that followed must be left to its proper context, the personality Seraphina helped or goaded him to compose. Actually, he must have gone east, to that old right wing of the Roman Empire to which all adventurous Italians, as distinguished from honest, still are drawn, to Minor and Hither Asia. Cairo, Baghdad, Smyrna, Aleppo, even Constantinople, may have received him, and fed him in return for his yarns, his daubing, his pandering, or his cheating. Like his innumerable compatriots who still drift through all the cities within a week of Suez, he would find himself at home anywhere but out of a crowd. He emerges for certain in Rome, lodging at the Sign of the Sun, poor and engaged in a messy little business, but which few consider immoral, especially not Carlyle, of selling bad art to the middle class, in species, touched-up pen-and-ink drawings of the usual monuments. A precursor of the picture postcard trade. In this shapeless state, he met his Seraphina, whose real or socially imposed name was Lorenza Feliciani. She was the daughter of a small tradesman, a girdle maker or glover, and a handsome girl with, like most others, romantic ideas. Unlike most others, she was prepared to put them into action. In fact, she was a born adventuress, and if there were more recorded about her and her share in the enormous life of her husband, very likely entitled to be called one of the greatest there have ever been. Nevertheless, it is true that her own will is so invisible for a long interval, or rather separately inaudible in the chord of adventure in which they were both merged, her share so apparently passive that she is usually forgotten by the writers whom the theme tempts, or, still worse, exhibited as a brave poor thing. The advantage of sentimentality is its shortcut through psychology. Nothing in the facts of the case can give us another version of the Griselda legend. Instead, it is probable, though there is not much more than the significant chronology to support me, that the metamorphosis of this obese caterpillar, Beppo Balsamo, into the gorgeous moth, Count Alexander of Cagliostro, pupil adored of the sage Althotas, foster child of the sheriff of Mecca, putative son of the last king of Trebizond, named Ilso Akarat, and the unfortunate child of nature, Grand Master Supreme of the Egyptian Freemasonry of high science, Grand Copter of Europe and Asia, was due, effectively, to little Lorenza, his mystical Seraphina. That is, the impetus, the welding of the dual will came, as it came in that other coupling of Lola and Louis, from the female side. Before the joint adventure existed that, single and successful, of Lorenza, the turning of a needy lying lout into what his nature was capable of becoming. This, for short, was a charlatan, the greatest charlatan the world has ever possessed, or suffered, which does not matter to this inquiry. The tonic note of her adventure was thus his personality, the education of his will, if the respectable term may be borrowed for a moment. In this, she conformed to the tendency which we made out from the case of Lola Montez, that the type adventure of woman is man. In his ungainliness she perceived dignity, in his loutishness an undeveloped quality of weight. In his untiring eager torrent of lies, boasts about himself and his travels, she detected not only an uncommonplace imagination, but that rare glint of auto-suggestion, self-belief, which is the radium of imaginative life. Dividing this stage of her adventure into the exploration of Beppo and the invention of Cagliostro, in the first she penetrated the mud flats and mean deserts of what he was, far into the tropical hinterland of what he might become. This talker might become convincing, because he was half convinced himself. Even for a little Roman staymaker, this insight into the man she loved was not specially remarkable, though audacious. Probably some sort of subconscious quasi-economic appraisement is inherent in the falling in love of all women. But what was extremely rare, in fact original, was the constructive effort with which she gave this intuitive exploration practical value. The education of a personality, as distinguished from that merely mental and physical, though it has had many illustrious exponents, the majority, it is true, no less illustrious bunglers, is still as strictly empirical as dowsing, or mediumship, or political economy. Learning, which she certainly did not possess, would not have helped her out. In her walks with him through the luminous squares and endless streets of her Rome, sitting on the steps of the Piazza d'Espagna, where the swallows fly, or on the lip of baroque fountains, in the vortex of the pilgrim tides of half the world, she must have studied her material and invented her practice, which for months while they were betrothed, she must have used in an audacious campaign on the citadels and palisades of his essentially barbarous spirit. Balsamo was evil-tempered, touchy, He must have resisted like a bulldog the ablation of those vices, those virtues which she decided to drag away out of him, traits like weeds choking the consistent outline of Cagliostro. She had to cure him of his low Sicilian penny fever, his mongrel habit in time of danger to snap and yelp, his cringe and his strut, both out of place in good society, both his fear and his hatred of the police, and to substitute in their place an unchallengeable indifference. To do all these things was delicate, for the balance of his confidence in himself must not be touched with a feather, or all was lost, both lover and venture. Higher and easier was the twin operation of fortifying what she left. Out of his lying to make a visionary, to select a coherent story from his luxuriant brag and confine him to it, to deflect his bent for pandering and make him specialize in the trade of commodities, more spiritual and also more costly than Eve's flesh, to extract a latent talent for stage management, such as he showed with the Sicilian goldsmith, to collate the coloured scraps of legend and superstition his ragbag mind was stuffed with, to deepen his fear of devils and his hopes of supernatural powers, and finally to believe in them all herself, and even in him. In short, she had luck and judgment, but no morals. So she made a personality out of a non-entity and unravelled the darkest problem in human dynamics, constructing out of a tangle of greedy contradictions a single, sharp will that could discharge itself upon the world like a bullet instead of a cartridge of small shot. Whatever her share of the adventure, she was the maker of the adventurer, an operation rarer and more dangerous than any magic Cagliostro ever knew. The direction of this new force, liberated by the love, vanity, and inspiration of a sharp little shop assistant, was through the spirit of the times to a personal power that both were content to wish as large as possible, without any limitation or detailed idea. This spirit, since it was the age of reason, was love of mystery, for it cannot be disguised that the prime effect of knowledge of the universe in which we are shipwrecked is a feeling of despair and disgust, often developing into an energetic desire to escape out of reality altogether. The age of Voltaire is also the age of fairy tales. The vast Cabinet des Fées, some volumes of which Marie Antoinette took into her cell to console her, it is said, stood alongside the encyclopédie. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland belongs to the same age and within 7 years of the same date as The Origin of Species. Indeed, the beginning of all folklore should be post-dated to the time when primitive man had lost his brightest illusions. This impression of disgust and this impulse to escape were naturally very strong in the 18th century, which had come to a singularly lucid view of the truth of the laws that govern our existence, the nature of mankind, its passions and instincts, its societies, customs and possibilities, its scope and cosmical setting, and the probable length and breadth of its destinies. This escape, since from truth, can only be into illusion, the sublime comfort and refuge of that pragmatic fiction we have already praised. There is the usual human poverty of its possible varieties. The shortest way out of Manchester is notoriously a bottle of Gordon's gin. Out of any businessman's life, there is the mirage of Paris. Out of Paris, or mediocrity of talent and imagination, there are all the drugs, from subtle, all-conquering opium to cheating, cozening cocaine. There is religion, of course, and music, and gambling. These are the major euphorias. But the queerest and oldest is the side path of magic, where this couple chose to establish themselves. Priests, touts, at your choice. A sort of emigration agency for Prospero's island for those wearied of any too solid dukedom of Milan. At its deepest, this magic is concerned with the creative powers of the will. At lowest, it is but a barbarous rationalism. The first of all are attempts to force the heavens to be reasonable. Whether there is any truth in this desperate sortie from truth is no matter. It is important in this story to remember that the operations of Cagliostro were entirely dependent on that focusing of the will that is called belief, not only in the followers, but most of all in the leader himself. There is a smart ignorance that explains men like Cagliostro with the one word hypocrite or cheat, a thesis which neither history nor even rudimentary psychology will swallow. The requirements of this adventure, of will and belief they had chosen, were an absolutely single will, and at any rate a workable and temporary conviction. Without a measure of both, they could not have sold a gold brick to an agricultural labourer. Their public was educated, often subtle, fantastic, but as critical as the paying audience at the first night of an opera. Even in the political branch, or spellbinding, the magician must believe in himself, if it is only as long as he is spouting. But will and belief, before they are marketable, demand a vehicle. That is, a personality. The substance of a personality is its past. Lorenza, not yet Seraphina, set herself to adapt out of the rich but incoherent yarns of her lover a ne varietur edition of his beginnings. As finally adopted, this made a remarkable story. Palermo events were cut out, as she had cut out his Palermo character. He was, they agreed to believe, the unlucky son of the last monarch of Trebizond, disinherited and exiled by the ruin of that distant kingdom. In his flight, he fell in with bandits who sold him in the slave market of Mecca, whose noble Sharif bought him and reared him in Kabbalistic wisdom. But when he grew, neither the magnanimity nor the favor of the Sharif could keep his ambitions and missions sedentary, so that at last the mage let him go, bestowing on him the romantic and pitying title of unfortunate child of nature. In his travels, he met a sect of whirling dervishes, also an Assyrian fraternity, and a Dom Daniel of alchemists, all of whom received him with honor, initiated him into their mysteries, and were reluctantly forced to let him go on his insatiable wandering. At Damascus, he found the Mahatma of all arcanic wisdoms, the sage Althotas, with whom he embarked for Malta, where the secret remnant of the Gnostic Knights possessed a subterranean laboratory. Here Althotas and he did great works in spiritual chemistry, in every work of the transforming and transmuting irreducibles which is proper to the imagination. They hinted he was obliged to kill Althotas. As for Lorenza, she contented herself with the name of Seraphina, mystery, and suggestion. She was left to the imagination, which she helped only with such hints as a foreign cut in her dressing and a foreign accent in every language. With this complete equipment of personality, will, and belief, the adventure might begin. But first there was an accident. The couple had taken up their lodging in her parents' house. Cagliostro had never been so comfortable. He knew more of the world than Seraphina, and assured her that it was folly to go further. With a basis of 3 good meals daily and a feather bed, he felt that his talents had their best chance of development here in Rome. All that they had planned might well be executed without stirring from the base. Seraphina was at a loss. Fate was obliged to lend her hand or her foot. For when all seemed spoiled, and the pair seemingly bound to waste their impetus in some hugger-muggery of fortune-telling, palm-reading, horoscoping in this back street, they were kicked out by the father, who came to a decision that he liked neither the face, the stories, nor the pretensions of his son-in-law. So with a sulkiness that unintentionally put the last touch to his makeup, Count Alexander Cagliostro put on his Prussian colonel's uniform, to buy which, practically new, his mysterious Seraphina had spent 1/12 of her savings, and accompanied by a hooded velvet figure, took the coach for Milan. We have no precise knowledge of their adventures for the next years. Even a bald account would have been better reading than all the poems of the time. Only the statement of the Inquisition biographer, who sets down instead a descriptive catalogue of their dupes, official synonym for the converts of a heretic. This contains a full set of personages for an historical drama: Italian counts, French envoys, Spanish marquises, dukes, and masked ladies of fashion. The couple appear at Venice, Milan, Marseille, Madrid, Cadiz, Lisbon, and Brussels. They travelled in a japanned black coach, with sober heraldry in gold on the doors, with 6 armed attendants in dark livery and a great deal of luggage. Everywhere they stopped, they had the same introductory technique, which was probably that of their poor and doubtful beginning. The romantic coach would draw up at the best inn of the city. They ordered their meal in a private room, asking for strange dishes in a grave voice and a strong yet indefinable foreign accent. At first, they must then have staged some little comedy of appearances at the window by Seraphina, looking unutterably sad and sweet, or chance collisions on the stairs and long, impressive, old-fashioned apologies by the Count to attract the right curiosity. But as soon as they had servants to be bribed and pumped, the introductions must have been much easier. The profession of magician, in which our wandering couple were thus rising to inaccessible heights, is one of the most perilous and arduous specializations of the imagination. On the one hand, there is the hostility of God and the police to be guarded against. On the other, it is as difficult as music, as deep as poetry, as ingenious as stagecraft, as nervous as the manufacture of high explosives, and as delicate as the trade in narcotics. Technically, in its upper atmospheres, where Cagliostro and Seraphina flew, it is social, for it aims to satisfy the deepest wishes of the human heart, which are rarely individual, and its tools are secret societies. The fear of death, crypto-sexual longings for supernatural terrors and beauties, and all the rest of the complex motive that sends men to Mahomet, Beethoven, or Cagliostro, cannot be satisfied adequately except by a church, an orchestra, or a Freemasonry. In occultism, this apparatus must be secret, for it is not a salvation, but an escape from the prison of reality into another world without birth or death, outside the organic flux, with another rhythm than the eternal out and in, conception and corruption, eating and excretion. The inscription over the little side door, where Cagliostro dangled the key, is Oser vouloir se taire, Dar will, keep silence. So a better idea of the skeleton of their doings, while the couple were posting over Europe, is not at all a plotless succession of coups, like Gil Blas or Eulenspiegel, but in the venerable records of missionaries propagating a faith and building a church. Their work was not the making of a blacklist, but a cult. Their captures were converts to be preserved, not dupes to be fled from, disciples to be put on the registers of the initiated members of the Egyptian Freemasonry of high science. President, a great unknown, living in the unknown recesses of the mountains of the moon, Grand Copter for Europe and Asia, Count Alexander Cagliostro, Grand Mistress, the disincarcerated Seraphina. This reticulated organism that spread its threads before it was done over 1,000 miles of Europe did not itself, in the magical way, spring full-grown out of the night. The first contacts between the couple and their adepts, those meetings in close-shuttered sitting rooms in the inns of the route, must have been rather masterpieces of suggestion and illusion than definite propaganda for the huge machine of which not a cogwheel yet existed. The curious inquirer who paid for the first dinner of the adventure must have been the beneficiary of a performance of unusual artistic value. Some virtuosic confidence trick worked with only the talk of the man and the silence of Seraphina, as distinct from the elaborate later exercise of the Egyptian rite as lyric from dramatic. Still, even without apparatus, the couple must have traded substantially the same commodity: mystery and the invisible, that is, spiritual romance. From this artistically penurious embryo, their adventure developed and branched rapidly. In their second town, they were able to offer a materialization of the devil. In their third, a range of those transformations, which are the first object of necromancy: hemp into silk, pearls out of pebbles, roses out of powder. They had a crystal ball and could produce in it the little iridescent scenes, bedroom interiors, inexplicable nostalgic landscapes, concentrated perspectives where figures of the past and future walk out, and in that are the recompense of long staring. Cagliostro could, for a consideration, show you a mandragore, those little earthly creatures who cry at night out of the earth at the foot of trees, and are born of the voluptuous and ambiguous tears of a hanged man. He had, like Descartes, in the legend, a satin-lined chest with him that contained a sylph 6 inches high, of the most perfect beauty and life. He reproduced the secret of Count Kwefstein, who knew how to fabricate homunculi by rare distillation and fermentations, who answered questions and lived in bottles, carefully sealed because they were quarrelsome. But all these curiosities were represented as preliminaries, installments of incommensurably greater mysteries he had in store. He showed them as a travelling circus puts a juggler and a clown on the platform in front of the ticket office to advertise the main show inside. Those who wished to go further were set on the first initiations of his Egyptian Freemasonry, and as it grew in his mind and in numbers, promoted through successive grades. The only details that remain of this organization are unfortunately mutilated and deformed. They give no fuller idea of the reality than a hostile detective could of the secret performance of a new opera, if he had only heard the chatter of scene-shifters. The music is not there, in these malignant accounts in the Inquisition records, which is all we possess, nor the plot, nor even the glitter. The men elevated to the rank of master take the names of early prophets, the women those of sibyls. The Grand Mistress Seraphina blows on the faces of the female initiates all along from brow to chin, and says, "I give you this breath to germinate and become alive in your heart the spirit of truth, which we possess by the names of Helios, Mene, Tetragrammaton." The recipient is led by a dark path into an immense hall, the ceiling, the walls, the floor of which are covered by a black cloth, embroidered with serpents. 3 sepulchre lights glimmer there, showing from time to time certain wrecks of humanity suspended by funereal cloths. A heap of skeletons makes an altar. On both sides of it are piled books. Some of these contain threats against the perjured. Others contain accounts of the working of the invisible revenging spirit. 8 hours pass. Then phantoms slowly cross the hall and sink without noise of trapdoors. The novice spends 24 hours here in the midst of silence. A strict fast has already weakened his thinking faculties. Liquors with which he is provided wear out his resolution and make him sleepy. 3 cups are at his feet. At last, 3 men appear. These put a pale-coloured ribbon round his forehead, dipped in blood and covered with silvery characters, some of them Christian. Copper amulets, among them a crucifix of copper, are tied round his neck. He is stripped naked. Signs are traced on his body with blood. In this state of humiliation, 5 phantoms stride towards him, armed with swords and dripping with blood. They spread a carpet on the floor to kneel on. The pyre is lit. In the smoke is seen a gigantic transparent figure who repeats the terms of the oath, etc. The stuff, as it is probably no worse than the current hocus-pocus of any secret society in the world. But in these vestigial, mangled remains of what was, quite likely, part pasteboard when new, it is vain to look for the most faded fragment of the high excitement it once stirred in souls that were neither simple nor trivial. It is a charred leaf of a score written in a mode and for instruments that are irremediably lost. However, there is something else to be found in rummaging this junk, a clue to the hidden progress of their adventure. For this rigmarole is a religious, not a magical rite. Its purpose, that is to say, is obviously the same as that of all mysteries, an initiation into a method of gaining immortality for the soul. The couple have been turned clean off their first course by the gulf tide of the human mind that rises in the depths of its profound constitution, the fear of death. Instead of their first offer, an escape from the cosmos, they have come down to offer merely escape from the grave. Their magic peep show has turned into a religious circus. Instead of sylphs, they trade in ghosts. Instead of an anodyne against disgust of human life, an elixir for prolonging it in secula seculorum. Following the glistening japanned coach of their destiny to and fro on the trunk roads of Europe, there are other similar changes of horses to be observed. The unfortunate child of nature progresses, if not in the science of the supernatural, in the science of men. He has discovered that drugs against life are infinitely more desired even than drugs against death, and he supplies them. He is as flexible as Casanova to the hints of his destiny. When he finds that Seraphina's body pleases even more than her aura, he was willing, says the Inquisitor, to supply even that. Seraphina too. And with impetus, he descends, since the road leads downwards, to the vulgar branches of the black art, quite deserting its subtleties. He makes love philtres. He has the secret of turning copper into gold. He asks his Ariel no longer for aerial music, but for cures for the gout. The noble and refined despairs that came to him turned out in the end to be only desires, and common desires, for health, for women, for survival, and above all for money. And it is curious to see how the pharmacopoeia of tricks of Cagliostro shrinks, as he grows in wisdom, to the single chapter of alchemy, the single nostrum for the single elemental desire of man, gold. The difficult therapeutics of Weltschmerz can be resolved in his experience into prescriptions for unrequited love, unsatisfactory health, unappeased fear of death. All these, with scientific economy, in turn superfluous if he can only teach the secret of quick and easy riches. So following the well-beaten road, he turned from magic to doctoring, from doctoring to psychology. Seraphina, his companion, pursued her private parallel to knowledge by his side. She learnt with irritation that all men want mystery in woman. But more than mystery, poetry. More than poetry, love. More than love, the urgent satisfaction of desire. After desire comes satiety, then use, the use to which Cagliostro put her, to get him money, which brought her out after an uncomfortable excursion to the summit of his own discovery. Come together to this much more venerable than Egypt's science of the human heart, their joint course leaves the mists and proceeds for a time in strict prose. They became a business partnership in the immortality, love-filtering and alchemist trade that had its regular booms and depressions. Very likely, it is true that Cagliostro was willing to oblige the widespread demand for a dependable and quick poison, often needed in the tangled affairs of great families, such as formed the most esteemed part of his clientele, to simplify a succession or solve a domestic estrangement. It was not for this, in the age of La Voisin and the Marquise de Brinvilliers, that his troubles with the high police of the whole continent progressively increased, nor because of the complaints of those dissatisfied with his expensive recipes for making gold cheaply. Alchemy, like astrology, breeds no skeptics. It was the religious and political penumbra of his doings that fascinated society's bulldogs and foxes, the infringement of the Christian monopoly in his Egyptian lodges, the odd twigs of democratic doctrine this eclectic jackdaw had built into his ritual. Cagliostro himself clearly saw how things stood and desired to excise the cause by abandoning, or at any rate reducing, what displeased his persecutors, the Egyptian scientific branch, and confining himself to the more paying pursuit of practical sorcery. But Seraphina had not come out for mere gain. With true womanly idealism, she loved the things that money can buy, especially the meals, She shared Cagliostro's enthusiastic appetite. The dresses, the comforts, but despised and misunderstood the materialism of earning it. She assisted him in his imaginative chemistry against her will, except perhaps in the matter of love potions, and never ceased to nag him for his neglect of the pure, though less profitable, supernatural. So their unitary will showed signs of disintegration. Cagliostro turned his head irritably towards his national and hereditary ambition, the status of a retired millionaire. Seraphina gazed constantly towards power and rank, some joint papacy of a vast underground religion, where in the becoming majesty of the robes he had invented for her, she would share in an empire over the minds of all the romantics in Europe, shake governments, shape lives, receive homages in the combined principles of hope and a little blackmail. Restated constructively, the end of the adventure already drags the course of the man. He is in love with satiety, but she is in love with adventure. Her pitch is higher. This is the moment of the Palermo catastrophe. Every day Cagliostro grew more sullen. Frequent quarrels were heard, questions of money to those that listened, underneath the profound discord of their projects. The heavier prevailed. They travelled to Palermo, where Cagliostro wished to round off his fortune and retire. We have seen what happened to Mahomet, when he too tried to step off his adventure in full motion, the merciless recoil of the past that shot him forward with accelerated velocity and higher trajectory than ever. So now with Cagliostro, his invented past had obliterated the real in himself, but not in his enemies, who were waiting for him with a vengeance matured to overproof by the long wait. He was recognized and clapped into jail for forgery, in the matter of the monastery will, and fraud, or sorcery, in that of the goldsmith. Seraphina saved him with the greatest devotion and difficulty. There was a lodge of Egyptian high science in Palermo. Its president, or copter, was the son of a great Sicilian noble. Seraphina knew how to settle the doubts that had come to this personage from the revelation of Cagliostro's real name and history, and not only aroused his interest in the prisoner, who stood in some danger of a capital sentence, but his fanatical zeal, to such an extent that, failing in peaceful maneuverings to get the case stopped, the adept came into the court with his followers, seized hold of the prosecuting advocate, and beat half the life out of him, until he agreed to abandon his brief. The judges themselves, never eager about the case after they learned what powerful friends now stood behind Cagliostro, consented readily to have seen nothing and forgotten everything, and our count was set free. For a long way from this, the duad is again perfect, its interior forces composed. Consequently, this is the period of their magnificence. The ritual gateway of the invisible kingdom is enriched by the full resources of their joint imagination. The Egyptian lodge creeps into every reserved part of the world. Society of Europe. Its adepts grow to thousands, with a fine proportion of princes, millionaires, and court ladies among them. Everyone capable of curiosity has heard Cagliostro's name, even if they do not hope anything from him. He and Seraphina and their coach became a sign of the times. Sometimes in honestly untidy antiquarian shops, you can still come across one of the busts that were made and sold of him in plaster or biscuit or porcelain, a most portentous face of scoundrelism, dew-lapped, flat-nosed, greasy, full of greediness, sensuality, ox-like obstinacy, a forehead impudent, refusing to be ashamed, and then 2 eyes turned up seraphically languishing, a touch of quiz too, the most perfect quack face. Of Seraphina there remains, as far as I know, nothing material on which to base even such a manifestly prejudiced portrait as this Carlyle. But intuitively, we know that her eyes must have been more intense than his, her pose less rhetorical, less explanatory. The besetting disfigurement of his personality, thrift, has for now quite vanished. They spend money splendidly, are never caught making it, so that mere speculation on their fortune is a pleasure to all imaginations. In conscious or unconscious mimicry of their only serious rival in history, Apollonius of Tyana, Cagliostro gave a bonus to his personality by giving the hospitals and the poor the preferential benefit of his science. The rich often failed in their first or second attempts to consult him, and he would visit in pageant the local infirmary as soon as he arrived in a city, dispensing to all the patients his extract of Saturn, the most famous and genuine panacea of those times. In 1780 he was in St. Petersburg, and had more persecution there, notably from the court physician who was a Scotsman, and reported to the emperor that Cagliostro's spagyric food, intended to increase the lifespan of its eaters to 2 centuries, was unfit for a dog. The German ambassador entering into the cabal with a complaint against the Count about the unauthorized use of a Prussian uniform, he was expelled. He lost more than he could afford on this spoilt voyage, and in Warsaw he botched an experiment in gold-making, was denounced by a rationalist courtier, and again forwarded out of the country. But at Berlin, Frankfurt, Vienna, he recovered his balance. So that when they arrived in Strasbourg in 1783, the couple had arrived at the very altitude of their adventure. In that rich city, where the roofs are superstitious, and the pavements cobbled like the contradictory character of the Alsatians, the great man was that most distinguished ass of history, the Prince Cardinal de Rohan, of the blood royal of Brittany. This de Rohan was immense in every way, in his person, his wealth, his importance, his vanity, his good nature, and in the unexampled mess into which these magnitudes were destined to lead him, the court of France, the institution of monarchy, and derivatively the general history of Europe itself. Into the centre of this mess, the affair of the diamond necklace, the first epicenter of the universal upheaval, the French Revolution, whose time was now near, the line of the Douad adventure led as straight as the pull of gravitation. Rohan wrote to Cagliostro as soon as he arrived to say he wished to meet him. The Count replied, with his unvarying technique, "If Monseigneur the Cardinal is sick, let him come to me and I will cure him. If he is well, he has no need of me, I none of him." The Abbé Georgel, the Prince Cardinal's memorialist, describes the further course of their relations. Admitted at length to Cagliostro's sanctuary, the prince saw, according his own account to me, in the incommunicative man's physiognomy, something so dignified, so imposing, that he felt a religious awe and spoke to him reverently. Their interview, which was brief, excited more keenly than ever his desire of further acquaintance. This he finally attained, and the empiric gained the prince's entire confidence without appearing to court it, and mastery over his will. "Your soul," he said one day to the prince, "is worthy of mine. You deserve to be made participator of all my secrets." This captivated the whole faculties of a man who always hunted after secrets of alchemy and botany. Their interviews became long and frequent. I remember once having learnt, by a sure way, that there were frequent, most expensive orgies in the archiepiscopal palace at Strasbourg, where Tokai wine ran like water to regale Cagliostro and Seraphina. From another testimony of the same period, by one Miners, professor at Göttingen, we have a fact of importance. The darkness which this Cagliostro has spread over the sources of his necessarily immense income and outlay contributes even more than his munificence and miraculous cures to the notion that he is a divine extraordinary man who has watched nature in her deepest operations and stolen the secret of gold-making from her. Gold-making again. He had also fallen into what was, for him, bad company. This was one Jean de Saint-Remy de Valois, a poor relation of the royal house of France, a sharp, bird-voiced creature who lived just over the border that divides adventure from resolute swindling. She was as attached to de Rohan as Cagliostro himself, but without any other apparatus than her wits, her tiny body, and her knowledge of court scandals. One of the juiciest of these was the long-standing bitterness between de Rohan, who had suffered quasi-exile in Strasbourg through it, and Marie Antoinette, the Queen. Jeanne also knew about the diamond necklace, the treasure and the ruin of the court goldsmiths, Boehmer and Bassange, who had locked up the value of a warship in it, hoping and hitherto failing to find a purchaser. It was known at court and to de Rohan that the Queen had been dreadfully tempted to acquire it. But the chronic bankruptcy of the Royal Exchequer, the King, or her own reasonableness, had dissuaded her from this. Jeanne had interrupted Cagliostro's mystical tête-à-tête with de Rohan with her plan, which the Grand Copter, after much resentment and hesitation, agreed to share in and assist. Cagliostro was anxious to get to his dessert, to make in one coup enough to transmute his supernatural adventure into the solid material castle in Sicily we have spoken of before, the natural breaking point of his single fate, from which hitherto the underpinning of Seraphina's had saved him. There was to be a great deal to share, exactly the value of the diamond necklace. The Queen wanted it. De Rohan, the only man in France who could afford it. But Jeanne had something better than this bare coincidence, for the bare truth is no bait for fools. She knew de Rohan, and she told him the Queen had fallen in love with him, deeply, to the extent that she longed for him to give her the necklace. There is a library of conjecture on the quality of Jeanne's authority for this request, the sum and point of her obvious lies. We know that she was a liar, but also that Marie Antoinette loved to exercise the rights of a pretty woman to be treacherous and imprudent. Also, that the Queen hated de Rohan very much. Our part of the story is that de Rohan fell into whoever's trap it was, and that Cagliostro brought up all his ghosts, sciences, predictions, and supernatural counsels to help him into it. The magnificent ass bought the necklace and sent it through Jeanne to the Queen, since when it has never authentically been heard of. But human stupidity, the source these two experts were tapping, is as ultimately treacherous and incalculable as any other elemental force, wind, water, fire. Here, it betrayed them disastrously. If de Rohan had had a grain of sense, the plot would have succeeded. Instead, the booby must needs go to the jewellers, Boehmer and Bassange, enjoy their thanks, and indulge himself in the nobility of telling them to thank, not him, but the Queen, for the transaction. Which they did. There are moments in history when the mind, with surprise, and excitement rather than consternation, becomes suddenly aware that the general train of events it has been watching is only a prelude. So at the bridge of Sarajevo in 1914, so with the visit of Boehmer and Bassange to Versailles to Marie Antoinette. It is as if we were startled by the rap of a conductor's baton and the following crash of the drums of the major orchestra of fate, whose invisible existence we had clean forgotten. The curtain rattles up on the first scene of the revolution, as if they had been carefully coached in foolery, without making a single error of sense. All these personages we have collected together played out their parts. The Queen, with perfect naturalness, had de Rohan arrested at the one moment when it would cause most noise and damage to her reputation, when the whole court was present to hear him say the Mass of the Assumption, the 15th of August, 1785. Her police, to make certain that the affair should do its maximum of damage by remaining a mystery, allowed de Rohan to destroy his papers. Cagliostro's arrest that followed made triply certain that the remotest curiosity of the whole of Europe should follow this public examination of the virtue of the Queen and the prestige of a whole regime by her enemies, the Parlement de Paris. Folly built on folly, in the true farcical style in which all the tragic chapters of human history are written. The steeple of this edifice was the verdict, ambiguous, mysterious, exonerating the condemned Jeanne de Valois by the acquittal of Cagliostro, whose complicity was a necessary part of the case against her, branding de Rohan as a fool by denying he was a knave, leaving on the Queen's reputation the fatal marks of an officious discretion. So, Cagliostro totters out of history, his glamour torn, his mysteries in rags, and worst of all, hopelessly unfashionable. He took refuge in England, the sanctuary of the out-of-date. If he had been alone, there he would have ended, in some seedy city debt jail, or in some legend of begging or guzzling hung around one of the unauthentic taverns in the tourist trade that are the fortune of the purlieus of Fleet Street. But in the imaginative silence that conceals him in London for months, there is at last a commotion, the track of his lost and heroic duade, Seraphina, to the rescue. And following on the reconstitution of the atom which his will had disastrously split in Strasbourg, there follows a sudden, painful emergence of the old Cagliostro, starting into our view again as a drowned man bobs up to the surface out of the mud. Juan de Morand, editor of a Courrier de l'Europe published in London, had for some time made it his distinction to be the foremost of Cagliostro's enemies. Cagliostro, enduring much in silence, happens once, in some public audience, to mention a practice he had witnessed in Arabia the Stony. The people there, it seems, are in the habit of fattening a few pigs annually, on provender mixed with arsenic, whereby the whole pig carcass by and by becomes, so to speak, arsenical. The arsenical pigs are then let loose into the woods, eaten by lions, leopards, and other ferocious creatures, which latter naturally all die in consequence, and so the woods are cleared of them. This adroit practice the Sieur Morand thought a proper subject for banter, and accordingly in his 17th and 2 following numbers made merry enough with it. Whereupon Count Front of Brass writes an advertisement in the Public Advertiser, under date September 3rd, 1786, challenging the witty Sieur to breakfast with him for the 9th of November next, in the face of the world, on an actual sucking pig, fattened by Cagliostro, but cooked and carved by the Sieur Morand, under bet of 5,000 guineas sterling that, next morning after, he, the Sieur Morand, shall be dead, and Count Cagliostro be alive. The poor Sieur durst not cry, done, and backed out of the transaction making wry faces. Thus does a king of red coppery splendour encircle our arch-quack's decline. Thus, with brow of brass, grim smiling, does he meet his destiny. Or rather, so feebly, but inimitably, the reconstructed adventure lifts itself from the mud into which its fragments had fallen, and essays to drive the old course. The inflexible, unadaptable course of Seraphina, which passed across all practical materiality, like the baseline of an astronomer through space. Her adventure could be broken off short, as it was when he gadded with Jean in Strasbourg. But it could not be bent. Now that she had triumphantly regained her man, she had and could have no new plan. Nothing but to begin all over again, the parabolic graph of her fate. The two set out, therefore, from London, on the same course they had laid, 20 years before, from Rome, to make a fresh start. There was nothing left of her but her eyes. Cagliostro had grown into a piece of unwieldy luggage. It was 1789, the grand days of terror and excitement. The two rolled like dismasted caravels in strange seas, through Basel, Aix in Savoy, Turin, at every stopping place presented by the police with an order of instant expulsion. Nowhere was any trace of Egyptian adepts. The temples of unreality were all vanished. They were hopelessly lost. The only thing Seraphina could think of to pick up her bearings was to go back to Rome. Cagliostro no longer counted, so from frontier to frontier they drifted heavily along to their starting point. Destination, rather, for there on the 29th of December 1789, the Holy Inquisition detects them founding some feeble, moneyless ghost of an Egyptian lodge, picks them off, and locks them hard and fast in the castle of St. Angelo. No, adventure does not end her stories in that style, with slick cues for pity or yawns. You must wait a moment for the end, until the inevitable has revenged itself in its obscenest manner on the dowdy, battered couple who had so long complotted against it. Both the unfortunate child of nature and the grand mistress of the fixed idea are now finished by any human dramatic rules. The zagging course and the soaring have both come to term, and the audience wait only to be released by a solemn curtain. Even some sort of a happy ending was possible, in matter of fact, for the Inquisition hesitated about letting them go. After a while, Cagliostro might have become Old Beppo, one of the curiosities of back-alley commerce in Rome, with a dignified, slightly cracked old wife, whose eyes were fascinating as long as she lived. Instead of that, we have the meaningless, unprofitable wickedness of the truth. When the accusation of impiety and liberalism was on the point of dropping for lack of evidence, Seraphina began to talk, venomously, treacherously, disastrously, blurting out the whole truth, and much more than the truth against her life's companion and meaning, supplying much more than the judges hoped for. She even told them the final secret, the one which Cagliostro cherished most, the details of his real name and unromantic birth, the sort of frenzy that makes women round on their lovers in the dock beside them, to their common doom. Some specific weakness of the sex, under the torture of justice, courtrooms, police, cells, which they can no more resist than tickling on the soles of their feet. But Cagliostro talked too. Between them, they made a horrible duet across the prison of betrayal. They spent nights of concentration when they had emptied their stock of memories before the police, devising cunning charges to down each other still deeper. Even the inquisitors at last tired of listening to them. Long before they died in the old prison, nobody paid any more attention to the two queer old dodderers.